Danielle St. Louis. Danielle is a co-founder and facilitator of the Love Circle Sangha and the executive director of the Brooklyn Zen Center. Having first taken root in the Tep Hai Vietnamese Zen tradition of Zen master Thich Nhat Hanh, Danielle has sat over 80 days on retreat at Blue Cliff Monastery, the Insight Meditation Society, and Spirit Rock, the Vipassana meditation as taught by Goenka in the tradition of Sagya Upai Khan and at the Brooklyn Zen Center. Danielle aspires to support liberation and dignity through mindfulness and meditation and increase access to these practices in POC, LGBTQI, and marginalized communities. She created the Insight Timer People of Color online group to connect POC meditators worldwide and supported multiple inward-bound mindfulness education teen retreats and completed the Interdependence Project's year-long meditation teacher training in December of 2015. Welcome, Danielle. Juan Sosa is a Puerto Rican bilingual bicultural social worker who has been practicing Vipassana meditation for the last 25 years, most of them at CIMC. Narayan Liebenson has been his teacher for most of his 25 years while he's been there. And in the last 5 years, he's been involved in the Cambridge Insight Meditation Center and an active member of the People of Color sitting group, where he serves as a practice leader that helps to offer sittings exclusively for people of color. He also participates in the People of Color Committee within the organization that is developing policies to promote diversity and inclusivity at CIMC.
Like, what issues should we be aware of and knowledgeable about? But like not actually asking the people of color in your community, what is it like to be you here? And what is it like to do diversity work in the community? And there's nuances to that. I mean, maybe I was asked and maybe I didn't fully hear the question and I didn't feel ready to respond, or maybe it wasn't like the right person asking it. Maybe I would have responded differently if it was a person of color asking me how I was doing. So those are the things that came up for me. And then the other thing I would say quickly is just that being a person of color in a predominantly white Sangha means that I'm typically sort of holding part of myself sort of back, or at least in the periphery in my typical interactions with my community, with some kind of recognition that it would be different if we all just came together and sat and then left, and that would feel fine. I wouldn't feel particularly sensitive about race, but that isn't what we do, and that's not Sangha. Part of Sangha is that some of us sit and listen and one person gets up and speaks, and that predominantly is a white person, and that is a position of power, it's a position of influence, it's a position of representing the Dharma and the Sangha. So there's a place where I'm listening as a person of color with a piece of myself holding back, waiting to see if this person has a certain kind of awareness of themselves and can speak from that place. So when I listen to Lama Rod speak or Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams speak, it is with a very different sense of hearing and a sense of a different sense of a teacher speaking. So, thank you.
Morning. Can you hear me?
No, that one.
Hold on.
How do you? Can you hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Again, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you. I also want to express a little bit of gratitude for Beatrice Anderson, who's not here with us today, but who's very much with me in this moment and has been with me for the last 2 years very strongly as we've grown Love Circle Sangha. So I share some of the experiences of my practice being tied to what I bring as a person of mixed race to the experience. I would say that because of my identity, I've always moved through the world leaving a part of myself out of spaces. So for me, when I found the practice, I, on a whim, decided to go to Blue Cliff and didn't know that it was the beginning of their winter retreat, which is when the monastics really settle in and have lots of ceremony and embark on a 3-month period of deep practice. So my experience entering into that space was feeling completely welcome, which is really interesting because it was a very foreign space to me. The ceremonies, the folks speaking Vietnamese, chanting in Vietnamese, but there was no question that I was welcome, and I think that's a part of that tradition and what Thich Nhat Hanh offers, but I think it's also because he's a person of color and how we welcome one another into spaces and how we invite each other. We being people who are often marginalized in some spaces, when the space is created by us, it's more about the collective. It's more about acknowledging that there might be different people in the room. So that was my initial experience, and I've been really blessed since then because I live in New York City, and there are many people of color sanghas there. So much of my practice has been in people of color sanghas, and so I kind of had the reverse experience of realizing when I went to sanghas that were not primarily people of color, noticing how uncomfortable I was and noticing how I didn't really, I wasn't paying attention to the Dharma because I was distracted by other things. So yeah, I would say that my experience in people of color sanghas is just a coming home, and also for me a sense of finding community where I haven't been able to in any other areas of my life. So thank you.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here with sharing the panel with some friends and some new friends. I prepared an answer to this question, then I left it at home. So I'm gonna have to wing it, which is exactly what I didn't want to do, because that makes me more nervous than I am. But this way, I listen to what other people said, and I get inspired by that. So I'd like to start by expressing gratitude to my benefactors who allowed me to be here today, including my teacher, my mother, and other friends who support me on this process of speaking up. The experience of being a person of color in a mostly white Sangha is not different from being a person of color in a white dominant culture. And I have many experiences in my life as a Puerto Rican social worker, but I have been the only person of color in the group. I attended Smith College School of Social Work. I was the only minority person in that class in 1989. So I made jokes about it, but that was just my way of surviving. So when at CIMC, which I've been for quite a long time, I mostly experienced that same thing, and I just live with it and sort of, what's the word, assimilate comes to mind. Puerto Ricans, we know how to assimilate pretty good. We have been assimilated by force and other mediums. So I know how to do that pretty good. I could disappear or minimize my presence, and in very many different ways, quietly, mostly. And it's something occurred when my teacher asked me to join. I think that's why it happened, that my teacher asked me to join the people of color group as I started to form 10 years ago. And I sort of resisted the change, but eventually became interested in seeing, well, what would it be if I see with other people of color? So then I went to a all people of color retreat at IMS. And I don't know, my memory is not good, but I think it was 10 years ago, about the same time this whole change in CMC happened. And I see, oh, this is different. I just felt like I could bring more of myself or something in it. And I joined the practice leader group right after the retreat and sort of commit myself to the practice and to bring other people of color into the center. And that changed the way I practice at the center, in that I became more outspoken. And well, people who see me there know that I usually don't say much. I mean, it's rare for me to be in front. I usually like to sit in the way back there, that gentleman sitting back there, and, But I think the experience of being in a people of color group and leading, had the option and the opportunity to lead a practice with other people of color had allowed myself to feel more comfortable with that, and then speaking and sharing what I've done. So I can bring more of myself instead of just some of myself into the practice. So I got more to take and more to give. So that's more or less my experience. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Good morning. Yeah, I looked at the question for a while, and it was hard for me to sort of prepare something to say. It felt sort of like what came to mind was, how do I separate this from the rest of my experience of being a person of color in white America? And again, it was sort of, I think part of drawing a blank was I'm not necessarily explicitly asked that question that often. And it's often a space that I feel awkward inhabiting unless I'm around people who usually look like me or share like similar bodies of experience. So thinking in that way, I think my experience of being a person of color in predominantly white sanghas has been like all my other experiences growing up in like predominantly white neighborhoods or going to predominantly white college. And there's a certain aspect, like when I come to the Dharma, it's always been about like healing and a very personal reason. So the Dharma has never sort of been like separate from that, who I am. I am a black man in America. When I sit on the cushion, the thoughts that come to my mind or the memories and things like that are always going to be wrapped up in my identity. So it feels like something that's always been there and is a big part of my practice. Compassion, bodhicitta is very much, for me, motivated by racial healing, anti-oppression work, things like that. Engaging more so recently with other people of color in Sangha has been amazing, and has kind of highlighted this part. Wow, I haven't really thought of this, and I haven't really asked myself that question, but I feel more comfortable bringing my full self to this experience, So I resonate with this feeling of like there's something being held back, and that is powerful, and now I can see it more in my relationships with some of my teachers, what I talk about, and how I am experiencing what they're saying. Maybe they don't really understand me, or they don't get what I'm trying to say, or am I not speaking the right way, or using the right vernacular or something. My experience has been a good one in some ways, and in other ways there's times where I felt like I wasn't really able to bring my full self or be heard. Yeah, I don't have much else to say besides that. I'm happy to be part of the conversation, happy to be here. I feel somewhat young and new to this whole thing compared to everybody else. But I'm happy to be in dialogue and glad that this is happening. This is the second Race and Buddhism conference. There's times where I felt awkward talking about race and social things in a Dharma context. Am I too angry or too passionate, or is this too mundane? I've actually had debates with Buddhist friends about, there's one specific debate was a gender issue, but race and gender, and some of the spiritual bypassing I think was happening in the conversation. This is like world transcending and like emptiness, and like, well, these things are also like happening. Yeah, so it feels good to be here.
Hello? Hello? Oh, wait, it's on now.
Yeah.
So nice to be in community with all of you. I'd like to also express gratitude, especially for my dear spiritual friend Darla. I wouldn't be here sitting in front of all of you had she not, for whatever reason, decided to pull me in to become a practice leader at CIMC for the People of Color Sangha. Total serendipity, I think. I was not qualified at the time enough to be a practice leader. I'm so grateful. It's really blown up my practice in so many ways I can't even articulate. So gratitude to her, gratitude to my fellow practice leaders and my Sangha members, and to all of you for being here. So I don't know if I can actually speak to what it means to be a person of color in a predominantly white community. I can speak to what it means to be an Asian American, because I recognize increasingly as a practice leader in a POC space that really POC encompasses so much. And we all embody very different experiences. And it's just the fact that white supremacy, oppression exists, that we've been brought together in a certain kind of way. And also I grew up, I've never ever thought of myself other than Buddhist. I grew up in a Buddhist family. And I spent part of my childhood, I spent 4 years during my high school years in Taiwan. So my relationship with the Dharma is very specific. So when I came back to the US for college, I was really looking for a spiritual home, and it was very challenging for me to find one. Especially in college, there were Buddhist communities, mostly Western and white, and I just didn't see the reflection of myself in those communities, particularly coming from a Buddhist family that's really like tradition and ritual, and which can also be problematic, but like there's something very personal about that, and I didn't see that in the more secular form of Buddhism. And also there was sort of some hippie culture mixed into it, and people were talking about like being able to drink mindfully and smoke weed mindfully, and I was struggling with that. So I had a hard time connecting spiritually with that. And then I also really struggled with sort of returning to sort of the Buddhist temples that I grew up with. You know, in both those communities, I had the experience of being both seen and unseen. Seen in ways that I didn't identify with, that felt like projections, like other people were seeing me, but not really seeing who I really felt I embodied. And then those parts of myself, I didn't feel like were seen at all. So being a part of the POC community at CMC has really felt like returning home, you know? I think the breaking of, moving away from the very traditional sort of Buddhist community I was part of, and then also there's just something about how challenging even for a POC community it is to come together, and yet we do, and there's just some kind of love that sort of is born out of that, and tenderness, and care. Yeah.
So I want to pick up kind of where Melanie talked about this idea of being seen and unseen, and the different challenges of what it means to be a POC in a predominantly white sangha. And so I'm wondering if some of the panelists would comment about, you know, what are those challenges that you alluded to some of them, but what does it feel like? What does it look like as a person of color in a predominantly white sangha? This challenge of being seen and unseen, the challenge of being a person of color in general in predominantly white America, of bringing to the cushion racism and different forms of oppression. And so I would love for you all to talk about what do they look like, those challenges for you?
I tend not to think of my race until someone else brings it up. I'm more acutely sensitive to my gender because I feel more vulnerable as a woman, be honest about that. But in terms of my race, I come from a very diverse family, so I have many shades. We are of different ethnic groups in terms of within my immediate family. If you were to see us, you wouldn't think that we were all sharing the same DNA. But in the United States, and also within my family, I learned about race, you know, what it means. By virtue of the complexion of my skin, I have certain privileges that some of my family members wouldn't have, and I acknowledge that. But what is it, I mean, when I said earlier, I bring my relative self into my practice, so I bring that to my practice, that experience. So the challenges sometimes that I feel in community, in the larger community, is that it's misunderstood why there is even a POC Sangha. In the sense, you know, why do you need this separate affinity group over here? And that in itself almost feels collapsed for me. It's not broad enough, because if we're able to welcome all, regardless of the shade of their skin, their gender, however they self-identify, we have a richer environment overall. So that's one of the main challenges. The other challenge I find is, because of the cultural differences, when I say something, is it understood? And language, I get tripped up in it often because I feel like I have to restate my point several times before I'm understood. And that's one of the legacies that, you know, when you're not of this culture primarily, even though I've assimilated, as Juan has stated, to the point where a lot of my culture's dropped. For part of it is safety, and part of it is acceptance. And as my family ages, I have this great affinity for the blessings that they have afforded me for making the trip to this country and the sacrifices, because for them, coming to the US meant their kids were going to get an education, which meant we would have a better livelihood and a better existence. But with that came all the other challenges of assimilating and being part of that. So, we bear the legacy of what privilege is for those people. When I say we bear the legacy, we are the recipient of what that means to us if we're not part of the dominant group. And not to say that those individuals who are part of the dominant group all have access or privilege. I'm not saying that, but it's a little bit more challenging to weave through a culture that already has the normatives of what it should look like. So that's where I feel is challenging at time, and I've totally digressed from what I wrote, but I just wanted to share that.
What I connected to with this question was, for me, the real challenge of what it means to trust in a community. I think if you're going to do this kind of work, my judgmental side might come out a little bit, but I just have a belief that it's deeply relational work, that it's deeply personal work. That if you're not making it about yourself and your direct relationships to people, you're missing a huge piece of the awareness. That the sitting and the practice is such a huge piece. Being knowledgeable about the current issues and systemic injustices in the world is a big piece. And then doing relational work, having some kind of group process. Essentially, it's the therapist in me that it looks like group therapy, honestly, where you're in the mix with people and having honest dialogue about your personal experience, whatever it might be, around identity and culture. That's my bias, and that's, I think, what it means to be in Sangha. I think it's a culture of being authentic with one another, and that's what we're holding each other to. And that's why I liken it, my affinity to hip hop, actually. That it's a culture where you're constantly trying to sort of, out of sheer respect for one another, trying to sort of also one-up each other in terms of how real can you be? How much can you show up and be who you really are, and say how you really feel and say how you really think, and that is unbearably messy. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche said once, the whole point of any relationship is to share some degree of honesty and to explore how far that can go. And in that way, relationships can become extremely powerful and intense and beautiful. I had this experience last weekend training with some sort of up-and-coming teachers in Shambhala, and a lot was coming up for myself around culture, as well as my good friend of color in the audience. And we dialogued about that, and we were brainstorming about how can we make this work. People of color Sangha, yes. White Sangha, yes, we need those. Having those two integrate and have dialogue, yes. And we're like, yeah, and then these ideas of like, we should do this fishbowl where folks of color are in the middle and talking about race and white folks are listening, and then we switch it and white folks are in the middle talking about race and folks of color are listening on the outside, and then we all kind of, digest that and process that. And then we talked to our teacher who's leading that training, and he's like, yeah, let's do that, like now. And so we did. And there were only 2 of us of color in a group of maybe 30. And I feel like we were as honest as we could be in that moment. And what I want to say about that too, though, is that it was one of the most intensely emotional things I've ever had. It was it's one of the times where probably one of the only times that I've been able to walk from an intensely emotional conversation about race and feel like relief. Because I saw white Sangha members of mine, people I love and care about, get intensely emotional in a way I've never seen. And I could see them carrying it in a way that they hadn't been for me, for us, for people. And that was like, wow, they're willing to do that. And I'm like, you know, I'm all in then, you know, like, you know, we're family, like we are gonna work, this is gonna work. And not only that, I recognized in myself, sorry, this is becoming long-winded. I recognized in myself that, wow, I also have this room to grow in terms of how much to trust these folks I'm with and love, with who I am. And they can hold that, and they can get intensely emotional and guilty and all kinds of feelings. And I can let them have that, and I can also trust myself to know how to care for them in that moment. And they can learn to trust me to say what I need, and all that good relational work that needs to happen. So thank you.
So I'm sitting here really feeling the energy of the folks around me, the folks sharing right now, and I'm just humbled, and I want to say thank you for your courage. I also, if I'm fully taking risk and being honest, I'm also really angry. A piece of that is that I think what's most challenging for me in Sangha is that, you know, the point that Juan brought up, which is our Sanghas are a reflection of this dominant, you know, culture that we live in. And it's very frustrating to confront our blind spots. It's frustrating in my daily life, but it's also frustrating in my spiritual life. And one specific example of that is at Brooklyn Zen Center, before I was part, let's say, of Brooklyn Zen Center, I was asked to participate in an undoing racism workshop offered by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. They're exceptional in offering a training around what racism has been in terms of historically, how it's you know, a systemic problem, and I sat next to a friend of mine at this training, and I remember her just touching my arm in moments, you know, and I barely spoke the whole weekend. And when I walked out of it, I acknowledged that it was the first time that I really felt like I just offered myself to others in a way that I didn't want to. And I just sat there and listened to people processing, people being at the beginning of seeing these things, and it's really painful. It's really painful to be reminded that we have these blind spots and that it affects me in every single moment of every single second of my life. And that some people, even myself, you know, the privileges that I hold, when I move through spaces and I'm not aware, I'm causing harm. And so, yeah, that's the challenge. The challenge is that it's not any different than how I'm moving through every day of my life, and then it's even more painful because it's this space that I cherish and this dharma that I feel is pretty clear, that it is relational, and it is about that we are very connected to one another. And so when the lack of understanding arises, it's really painful. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, a couple of things on my mind. I think one, like, seems like a basic challenge, but it just, you know, I feel like there's a challenge of having to move between like multiple different worlds, you know. So I wasn't raised Buddhist, so I had to adopt Buddhism, right? You know, I practiced Tibetan Buddhism, which is like totally far removed from anything relevant in my life and anything like my family, like my community of color, like my people, my family specifically. So there's a challenge of having to like leave like a comfortable kind of zone. You know, most black folks that I don't know are doing. Most black folks that I know aren't doing like Tibetan Buddhism, and so that's sort of like a challenge. You know, feeling a little awkward in a new space, and always sort of feeling like, you know, I gotta have my, like in America, you know, sort of where do I belong? How am I carrying myself? How am I being perceived? So that's just like a subtle challenge, I think, that sort of just came to mind. And then interacting with the tradition and it speaking to me. And lately that speaking has sort of been pointing me back to like where I came from. Which doesn't necessarily always feel like a challenge, but just moving between those different worlds is challenging sometimes. When you are a marginalized identity, there's sort of an emotional labor and management that one, I think, has to do all the time. You don't have that pure subjectivity. And something else that's challenging, I think, you know, to take a risk. I don't know if it's like anger. I think there's some anger. I personally like. It's sort of challenging that certain things I feel like need to be specifically addressed. And I mean, obviously, those are good things. Conversations are good to have and things like that. But I think when I think of like Dharma and practice is like a radical self-honesty. And so these issues that we're talking about, race, you know, throw in like class and gender and things like that, I don't see how those can be outside of our circle of practice. You know, the Dharma, you know, you're practicing, there's an awareness, a sensitivity, things like that, and we move into the world, and you know, the world is structured in a way, these things are happening all the time. So it's a little challenging for me, and maybe this is just me, my bias or arrogance, whatever, but having to specifically address something that's always like so real to my experience. You know, and then I've been reading slowly Between the World and Me, and Coates talks about you know, these sort of he talks about like the dream, right? The dream of whiteness and race and things, and how these always have an effect on the body. You know, it's very real. So it's sort of a challenge for me sometimes lately. You know, where I prefer to be sometimes talking about these things with other people of color, because it's challenging to feel like I have to be teaching or sharing or talking about something that's like always been so obvious to me, or like I heard about ever since, like, you know, my mother was talking about these things, my uncle, things like that. I wasn't Buddhist, and I wasn't in a Buddhist circle. It was in a Jehovah's Witness circle. You know, what is it like being a black person in like a predominantly white congregation? So that's sort of a challenge. It's a beautiful challenge in a way, but again, it feels sort of like work a little bit sometimes.
So I guess two things. One of just the challenges of being me as a person of color in a predominantly white community, or maybe first to say that for me, I acknowledge it's a real privilege that I grew up in a Buddhist family in certain ways, because I never question whether I belong in a Buddhist community, or I never question whether or not the Dharma is for me, because, you know, that has been the privileged environment I was raised in. And as a practice leader, it's something I think a lot about is, you know, when people come to the people of color sit, part of it is entering a space where they feel like, oh, this is a space I could even just visit, you know, and it's like maybe like a first connection of like, will they come and stay and engage with the Dharma, or will they leave, you know, and that's, for me, that's never been an issue because of the nature of the circumstance of how I was raised, you know, so, but, so when I'm a person of color in a predominantly white community, I'm dealing with a lot of like spiritual exoticism. And it's like, this is just normal me, right? Like, I'm just being me, engaging with my dharma and my spirituality, and yet, like, all this stuff is coming at me, you know, and how can I have the capacity to continue to engage and practice while also, like, I wouldn't use the word of holding space for that, but like, just being in that presence too, you know? And then I think the other challenge, just sort of as a broader thing, is dealing with the idea that a refuge for all, I think oftentimes it's thought of as inclusion, diversity, there's another word. And I want to challenge that. Like, does a refuge for all necessarily mean integration? That's the word. You know, like, I've been thinking a lot about that and sort of thinking about communities more like ecosystems, where there's like treetops and like floor dwellers and everyone in between, and the people up top, not to stratify things, but like we all like have different needs and different, in order to engage with the Dharma fully, right? And so what does integration mean? You know, can like birds, like the way they need to live and be fully themselves is different from like animals that are moving on the floor, and they may never interact, and yet they're deeply, deeply connected to each other. That like biodiversity is like interconnected. So I've been thinking a lot about like, because the challenge is being a part of a POC community within a larger white space is there's always the question, like Navalette said, why separate, you know? And how can we think about when we're nourishing other like communities within our community, it's nourishing ourselves, even if they choose to engage with the Dharma in a separate kind of way, like, and how are they still a part of my community, even if our paths don't cross that often, you know, and well, how is that nourishing of a community, right? So, decolonization, not integration.
So when I think about the challenges in front of me or inside of me, I'm talking about racism. I'm mostly informed by what I learned in social work school about racism and the dynamics between the oppressor and the person oppressed, which usually that the person oppressed as word I used to assimilate or accommodate is the right word to the person who's oppressed. So the challenge for me is that I'm so used to accommodate to others, and it's hard to break that pattern inside of me, because it's like a little slave inside of me, if I could call that I want to be free to speak up and do as I please, but it has, you know, a parameters around them that sometimes limits it. So one of the challenges personally is speaking up, because I don't really like to speak up. That's why I'm grateful I was invited to speak up, because otherwise I would be sitting in the back of the room. And the other challenge is, you know, how do you talk about that power differential with other people where they don't know they have the power, or they're not aware of the power. That's hard to do. Because I don't feel that comfortable myself bringing it up or say something about it. And when people want to talk to me about it, I try to listen and say, yeah, that must be difficult to have all that power and have all the benefits. But I can relate to that. And I'll tell you how I can relate to that, because being a male in a Latino culture, you got a lot of power. And I have to admit it, I do. But only when I go to Puerto Rico. And people, you have a dinner, people try to serve you, and things like that. And I serve myself. So I can relate to that, and that's how I worked understanding the dynamic of the power, speaking up, and sharing the experience, like I'm doing now, of what it is to be on the position of not having that much privilege here, where you have been in places where you have the privilege and the power, and now you don't. And it's, okay, well, gotta work with that. That's my challenge every day, to know that part of me. And I think that being a people of color group sitting in CIMC have offered me that opportunity to feel comfortable and to be a leader where I could speak up and also listen. Because that one thing about Buddhism is very, in general I see it a very democratic and equalitarian, at least our sitting, we try to create it that way. And that's something that have made me feel safe. Because the challenge of finding safety, even though you might be the only person of color, is a challenge, but usually you have a good teacher and good leader that you'll be able to find that, and that's really, really important in this, with this work. So, thank you.
So I want to kind of pick up where Melanie talked about, is integration the goal? And I think that's a powerful and provocative question. And as you were asking it, I was thinking about, the whole, when people say, well, why Black Lives Matter? Why not say all lives matter? And thinking